All right, welcome everybody. Good evening, and I'm glad you're here for the kickoff event for the 2021 Centenary College Research Conference. I want to thank everyone for making the time to attend tonight's discussion about the documentary Picture a Scientist, and I hope everyone will get the opportunity to enjoy the hard work our students have done over the past year and check out their research tomorrow. My name is Leal. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Biology. I'm also on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of the American Physiological Society. So before we begin, I would like to thank the Attaway family for providing the funding to make this event possible. And I also want to encourage everyone to attend the research conference, again, because students and faculty really contributed their time and hard work to this event. All right, now I'd like to introduce our three panelists. Thank you so much for being here. And first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Charity Morgan. She is currently an associate professor in the Department of Biostatistics at the University of Alabama, Florida. She has collaborated on projects in a variety of scientific fields, including psychology, neurology, cardiology, and anesthesiology. Since 2017, she has chaired the selection committee for the UAB School of Public Health's Janet L. Norwood Award for Outstanding Achievement by a Woman in the Statistical Sciences. Thank you for being here, Charity.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Darby Proctor. She is an NIH-funded assistant professor of psychology at Florida Tech. Her research focuses on decision-making in non-human primates in order to understand the evolutionary roots of decision-making biases. She was instrumental in setting up a collaboration between Florida Tech and Brevard Zoo and conducts research with their animals, most notably the spider monkeys. She is also interested in pedagogy and increasing student involvement in the classroom, and she created roachlab.org to provide hands-on animal experiences for undergraduate students at Florida Tech and beyond. Thank you for being here, Dr. Proctor.
Pleasure.
And finally, we have Dr. Audrey Stone. She's an assistant professor and the director of the Autonomic Control of Circulation Laboratory at the University of Texas, Austin. She investigates the exaggerated cardiovascular responses evoked by exercise in those with type 1 and type 2 diabetes, and these projects are funded through an NIH R01 grant. Dr. Stone is active in the organization Graduate Women in Science, and she serves on the Women in Physiology Committee for the American Physiological Society. She and her wife have a 1-year-old daughter who motivates them to keep investing in the future of women in science. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Stone.
Thank you.
All right, so our format for this evening is that our panelists are each going to share some thoughts about the film and what it means to them to be a woman in science and some experiences they've had. If you have questions, please write them in the Q&A box. Feel free to use the chat. However, I will not be able to monitor and respond to comments in the chat. If you know me with technology, I struggle. So please just let me look at one box, which is the Q&A. I really appreciate it. All right. We'll just go in the order of the introduction. So Dr. Morgan, would you like to start?
Yeah. So yeah, of course, thank you so much for organizing this, Anna, and for having me. I was really impressed with the movie. I found it, the stories of all the different women were, so relatable and both shocking and not shocking at the same time. And so when I was trying to think about what I was going to say about it, I was thinking, well, what in the movie actually surprised me? Because I think if you're a woman in science, a lot of what they said would have sounded very familiar to you. Maybe you didn't have the exact same experiences, but I think we've all experienced someone not taking us seriously or little comments about our appearance. And what was even going into it thinking like, okay, I know what women in science go through. I know what I'm going to see. I was still so shocked by Jane Willenbring's experience in Antarctica. It was just so blatant, the horrible things she had to go through. As clear an example of sexual harassment that you will probably ever see. The fact that she was being called slurs based on her gender, she was being pushed down mountains, she had rocks thrown at her, and it's just amazing all that she went through. And one thing that I was, thinking about when she was telling her story is that she started out talking about how much she loved science and why she got into it, and how going to Antarctica was this amazing opportunity, and she talked about how beautiful it was there. And I was thinking about, like, that would have been a dream come true for any scientist to get to do something like that. And she must have been so excited when she got there. And the fact that this guy was able to steal all of that joy from her through his behavior, which is so, so tragic. And so, her story really spoke to me in the documentary because it was just so blatant and so horrible. And I remember the part where her friend who was there with her was talking to her brother at her wedding, and he mentioned being in Antarctica with her, and her brother having a reaction of like, "Oh, you were there for that," and the friend being like, "What are you talking about? I don't." And then his response was basically, "Oh, I hadn't realized how bad it was." And I just can't imagine seeing a colleague having rocks thrown at her, being called all kinds of swears, having comments made about her sexuality, and not realizing that was a bad thing. And so it kind of shows, I think, two sides of this problem. One are the people, mostly men, who carry out this behavior, but there's also the people who let them get away with it. And I don't know that her friend really realized that he was part of the problem too. He did step up, he did write a letter, he supported her in her complaint, but he was also there when all that stuff was happening and never said a word to her or even stood up to the advisor. So, there's a lot in the movie to talk about, and I'm sure the other panelists have stuff they want to say, so I don't want to, ramble on too long, but that was something that really moved me. With her story was just incredible in a lot of ways, both good and bad. And then having, this guy get away with that for so many years, realizing he had driven so many women out of science, or at least tried to drive them out of science, and having a panel of his peers say, "Well, we'll give him 3 years off and then he can come back." It was, what else do you need to show this is a problem if you can't get a guy who calls you slurs and thrown rocks, get that guy thrown on the field? What hope is there to get the smaller things taken care of if something that blatant just gets this live guy? So that's kind of the main takeaway for me from the film, was just Jane Willenbring's experience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morgan. I agree. I think it also showed how resilient she was, that she is still in science, and she tucked it away. And I mean, props to her for speaking out when she felt that it wouldn't affect her career. I think that was amazing of her. Thank you. So, Dr. Proctor, what would you like to share?
Yeah, I thought the movie was really powerful as well. And I really enjoyed the title of it, Picturing a Scientist, because it reminded me immediately of this psychology experiment. So I'm going to test you right now. We're going to do a psychology experiment. So there's a man and a son who are in a really bad car accident, and they're rushed to the hospital. And the surgeon comes in and says, "I can't operate on this kid. He's my son." Explain. Well, if you are like most people, you initially thought that the surgeon is a man and didn't get around, at least easily, to the solution that the surgeon was actually the kid's mom, right? Because we still picture a scientist as these strong male figures, and we need to create pictures in the minds of others that, you know, a scientist can look like anyone. So for my postdoc, I was in a cool program called the Fellowship in Research and Science Teaching, and it was, you know, mostly research, but we also did teaching at historically Black colleges and universities. And so I was teaching a class at Spelman, which is a historically Black women's college, and the students had a presentation coming up. And one student raised their hand and she asked me, do I need to straighten my hair for this talk? And I was admittedly oblivious at the time, thinking I don't really pay attention to fashion trends. I don't care what you do with your hair, and said something to that effect. And they said, oh, no, there's an older male professor here that he makes us straighten our hair because he says that's the only way you can look professional. And so this is still a very modern problem. You know, I was teaching there, I guess not all that long ago. Maybe it seems long ago to you guys, maybe 5, no, I guess longer than that, 10 years ago. But this is something that's still occurring. And, you know, I'm in psychology, which tends to be more heavily female than a lot of the other sciences. But even in psychology, you still see this type of sexism, even when it's completely inadvertent. So one of my mentors was a man who was great. He was a strong supporter of women being in science. And one time we did an experiment, and I was creating a video for the press about the experiment. And so it was my experiment, so I did the voiceover. And when I played it for my mentor, he immediately said, oh, well, don't you think you should get a man to narrate it so it sounds more authoritative? And to his credit, I just looked at him until he backed off and he said, I'm completely wrong. I'm sorry, your voice is great, and immediately backtracked on that. But it was still that initial first response that this isn't what a scientist sounds like or looks like. And so, you know, this is something that you all will face in your careers, whether you're in academia or not. And so it's really important for us to have these types of conversations with women in these positions so that we can show you all, the next generation, that this is what a scientist looks like. And so I'm happy that all of you are attending and watch this really powerful film. And I can't wait for us to get to the Q&A so we can really get into what you all want to know about.
Thank you, Dr. Proctor. I think that's very important what you said too about this is not just about science. I think, you know, people in humanities have the same problem. And when we talk about these, you know, leaky pipelines, we see that there are more women in higher ed than there are men, and yet somewhere we are losing them because they don't stay in academia. But most schools have more women undergrads. So I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you so much. And Dr. Stone, would you like to share your thoughts?
Hi. Sure. Yeah, I've been an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin for about 6 years now. And before that, I did a postdoc at Penn State, and that's actually how I met Dr. Leal. We did a postdoc together. So I've been in a few different environments where it's definitely a male-dominant science, male-dominant field. I think that I have always been pretty acutely aware of being a woman in a man's field, with just little things, right? Like, how am I dressing, right? Like, I don't want to dress too provocative, but I also know that they want me to look like a woman. And like, for an example, a few years ago, I've always had long hair. A few years ago, I cut my hair off. And I was so nervous going to my first conference. And I'm talking like 3 years ago, right? I was so nervous to go to my first conference where I would see my male colleagues and wonder if they would think that I looked feminine enough, which is weird, right? I'm talking about these people who walk around in like tennis shoes and maybe a wrinkled polo, right? They don't even think twice about what they're wearing or, you know, if they've brushed their hair. And I'm like, how do I look, you know? So anyway, I've been aware of that. And also I've kind of, I don't know, I think I was part of the problem for a long time. I always wanted to not be what men would consider like the typical woman, right? Like I wanted to be an exception. And I wanted to not ally myself with other women. I wanted to ally myself with men, right? But even still, I wasn't fitting in with them. I was still the woman trying to fit in with them. And I think that I alienated myself from a lot of women and from a lot of opportunities to have, I don't know, friendships, colleagues throughout my career. And I'm really working hard at that, like deliberately now, because I know the importance of it. But for a long time, I wanted nothing to do with being like women, right? Because I bought into the stereotypes. And yes, I am partly ashamed to say that that's how I was, but it's also kind of freeing to realize that that's how I was, and I was part of the problem. And so I know both sides of this, and I know how I definitely don't want to be, and I can make effort in little or small ways, at least for my students or for those that I mentor, in definitely a positive direction, and really affirming how important it is to be a woman in science, and you should be proud of that. And you should be proud of your other female colleagues. And I take a lot of pride in that and who I am now. Oh gosh, when I moved to Texas was actually when I first started paying more attention to the way that I thought about women. And which is weird to say that I learned that when I moved to Texas, but I met a brilliant woman here who happened to be very much so into human rights, and we ended up getting married. And so my life has now become a lot of, all about women and women's rights and human rights and women in science and health and research. And so it's, I don't know. I'm very proud of who I am. I probably go overboard with trying to be supportive of my female students. I try to get involved in as many women positive groups, especially pertaining to science, like with Graduate Women in Science and the American Physiological Society. I try to do as much of that as possible. So I was really excited to be asked to be a part of this panel because I had been encouraged to watch this from one of my friends. And I have to say, the first time that I saw the film, I was just kind of like what Dr. Morgan said. I was just kind of like, yeah, this sounds familiar. If it's not exactly the same, I've kind of experienced this, and none of it was too surprising. I mean, some of it was like definitely over the top from what I would have expected to see, especially the Antarctica story. But I have watched it several times since, and I've been able to pick up on lots of little things that would resonate with me. And even to the fact where I never would have thought about an experience that I had in being kind of the way that they were talking about it, but they just really shed light on some experiences that I would say were uncomfortable, but I didn't know why they were uncomfortable. And so when they were highlighting, I think it was like the iceberg experience, they were explaining it using like the iceberg, right? And so when we think about sexual harassment being that the very top, right, just the gross sexual come-ons or harassment, right? And really it's not that. That's really what's rare. And it's so much underneath the surface, just little things. And I really liked how they explained the little things. So they were talking about casual put downs, right? Or subtle exclusions from something, or left off an email, or not being invited to collaborate. And I was like, wow, I've never really thought about it in that way, but I'm absolutely excluded in that way, or that absolutely affects me. And those are the types of things that happen several times a day that just beat me down, right? And I never really feel like I've had a voice to say, oh yeah, I've been sexually harassed, or, there's sexual discrimination here. Because how do you explain that? Right? Like, how do you explain all these little things? And I don't know, that part really resonated with me. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes real quick because there were so many things that I liked, and I'm not going to take all the time to talk about everything. But let's see. Another thing was kind of this feeling of kind of being invisible. I think that one of the ladies was talking about making a comment during a meeting, right? And nobody follows it up with anything, or they're all just kind of quiet for a second, and then they just talk over you like your comment didn't even make a splash in their pond. And then later on, someone says the exact same comment, a male colleague, and they get full credit for it. And it's like, do we really think that that just happened? You know, and that's the type of thing that happens over and over and over again. And so that part is hard. I do have to say that when I first started at UT, it was very difficult. I was the first exercise physiologist woman that had ever been hired there. And so navigating that male-dominated space was difficult for all of us, right? It was difficult for me. I somehow made it difficult for them. And since then, we have, as a department, put a lot of effort into diversity and inclusion and equity. And it's a very, very, very slow process, but the first part is admitting that there's a problem. And so I am proud of my department and the fact that we have admitted that there is a problem and that we are working towards correcting it. And it's not comfortable. It's not a comfortable space to be in, but I am glad to be in that space so we can move forward to better things. So anyway, I'm happy to answer any questions about that in the discussion if you want to. But thank you. Thank you for listening to me talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stone. I'm glad that you brought up the iceberg. Yeah, in my notes, I wrote down everything that was in the bottom of the iceberg under the water. And I know personally that some of those have happened to you because I've seen it. And, you know, I do think that like when it happens to you, you don't even realize it's happening to you because we're so used to, that's just how it is, right? I mean, when I was getting my PhD in this exercise physiology lab, I was, you know, the only grad student, and there was a postdoc, and then there were, you know, the PIs, and I couldn't be a part of their like fantasy football team because I was the woman there. And I'm like, really? Like, it's exercise physiology, you know, we all love sports. We're Dallas Cowboys fans. Come on. And just little things like that. And so
it's really funny. In grad school, I broke the barrier of the fantasy football team. I think I was the first woman to play on it.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so we have some really great questions, and I'm gonna start asking or relaying them. So the first question is from one of my students, Jessie, and she's actually in Dallas now. So she asked, how can we change the societal predisposition of others to view males as a scientist? Or I really think, you know, of any profession, like how do we change that where you think it should be a man?
I can start with that. It's hard, I guess. I mean, part of what we can do is what we're doing now is talking about these issues. You know, like if people do have these unconscious biases, calling them out, making them realize that they picture the surgeon as a man, things like that are the ways to get people to start thinking about these things. And, you know, going back to the movie, I think it was Raychelle Burks does all this outreach. She talks to conferences. She has a YouTube channel. She has a podcast. Just putting yourself out there like, hey, I'm a scientist too. Scientists look like me too. I think it's going to be a slow process, but just by refusing to go away and refusing to hide is how we might start to make that change.
Thank you. I think that's a great point, and that was something that I brought up in my notes, just conference culture. So I feel like conferences bring out the worst behavior a lot of times. Do y'all have any, I don't know, advice maybe, you know, of just how to navigate, you know, so our students are presenting their research tomorrow, right? How do you present your research and have respect and, you know, not demand respect, but, you know, have respect for yourself and your work and, you know, not be made to feel less than, I guess.
Yeah, I would think that, one of the best things to do is prove that you have the knowledge and that you deserve to be presenting your research. There's this thing called the imposter syndrome, and a lot of people, and in particular women, experience it, is when you get into something like you're going to present your research at this poster presentation tomorrow, that you feel like you shouldn't be there and you don't belong. But those are thoughts that tons of people have. I have that thought. Earlier today, I was talking to my wife and I said, well, why did they ask me to do this? And she's like, well, you've done all this stuff in this area. And I was like, oh yeah, that's why. But even people who are really successful in these careers, we still have those doubts, but recognize them as your own doubts and not what you need to portray to other people. Be confident in what you've done. And be confident that you have the knowledge to answer any questions these people might ask, because you're probably more of an expert in this little area than they are. So just remember that you know a lot, and to be confident in that.
I'd like to make another comment about conference culture, not really pertaining to Zoom, but in-person conference culture. It's one of the predicaments that I found myself in as a student, as a postdoc sometimes, and I have now found my own students in these positions in the social aspect of conferences, right? You are around people who you know through their papers, through their research. You hope to maybe get a postdoc or work with them one day, and it's so neat to see them in person. And there is alcohol, and a lot of the well-established scientists are men, older men, and I think that that's a little bit harder to navigate, right? Especially to be a younger junior woman navigating the social scene at a conference with older men who are used to being able to act a certain way. And what's that line that you need, or that standard that you need to hold yourself to, right? How late do you go out with these people? And I don't want to sound like a mom here, but just seriously, like, do you want to be known as the fun person, or do you want to be known as a scientist, right? And like, I think that gets kind of cloudy at conferences sometimes, because you're like, oh, they totally like me. We were chugging beers together for, till 2 o'clock in the morning. And I'm like, no, now they just think that you're like a fun go out girl, right? Like they still know nothing about your science or what you're capable of doing. And I think that that's important to remember, right? Like, why are you at the conference? What do you want to be known for? And it's not that you can't go out and have a good time and be social. Like, it's great that you're social, but kind of in your mind, know what those lines are, or your boundaries of what you should or shouldn't do. And if you have a question, I would ask your advisor or your mentor or someone else that you respect, like, what do I do? That's my piece.
Yeah, I totally agree about conference culture. I work in statistics, and statistics very recently had sort of a big reckoning moment where some of the top names were finally outed as behaving inappropriately at conferences. I think some of these older male professors treat it like it's a party. They can go out, they can drink, they see all their friends. And the younger female colleagues are just there as party favors. We don't belong there. We're just there for them to, hit on or ask us, oh, I want to discuss your research. Let's go for a drink. I'm like, we can talk about my research right here at my poster. We need to go out to do it. And I know that, we have to go through every couple of years of the sexual harassment and diversity training over and over again just to keep everyone current. I know they recently added saying, yes, your behavior at conferences counts as workplace behavior. It's not a free-for-all. You still have to be professional at conferences. And I think that for a long time, people treated it as it doesn't count if you can, at a conference, you can go, you're out of town, you're hanging out with your peers, you can drink as much as you want to, you can proposition female colleagues, and that was also in the movie as well. And so, yeah, conference culture is something that no one ever told me about as a student. It's something to watch out for. And I think that's one of the things we need to change, is letting our students know hey, this is another area that you have to navigate. And it sucks that there is so much that you have to be aware of and be scared, not scared, but be on your guard about. But yeah, I totally agree with the others that conference culture is also a problem beyond, not just the academic in the classroom setting, but out there in the world in conferences too.
And like the movie mentioned, the stuff that we brought up here is sort of that tip of that iceberg. There's so much more underneath, the way an older male professor puts his hand on the small of your back while you're talking, right? Probably doesn't mean anything by it. That's a different generation. That's how they were raised to treat women, but still not okay, right? You're not walking around touching the guy grad students like that, or touching your upper arm, right? That those are, these really subtle ways that they're treating women differently, in addition to those big blatant ways.
Yeah, I have a colleague who calls me sweetie. He's in his 80s, so I feel almost bad being like, hey, can you not call me sweetheart? But yeah, like you said, like you feel like, well, they didn't really mean anything by it. So, and then you feel like you're the bad person if you make a big deal about it. And sometimes it's just easier to let stuff go than to actually call people on some stuff. And, with the different generation issue, that can be a real conflict. Like, what do I take the time to call out and what do I just have to let slide? And sometimes it's hard to decide.
So that's great. So one of our questions was, how do you, and the question specifically asked, how do you address women who, might, I don't want to say aren't being the best allies, but men too. I mean, what is the polite way to address people and tell them, we should not be treated like that?
I mean, I don't really have an answer. In terms of women who aren't your allies, I know that my very first department chair was a woman, and she told me that I was never going to be taken seriously unless I dressed more professionally. I needed to wear business casual all the time. And at the same time, there were male faculty members in the department who wore jeans and T-shirts every day. But I'm being told that I need to dress up and wear, dresses and, sweater sets. And, there's this stereotype of the math professor who's covered in chalk and crazy hair everywhere and really absent-minded. So that's what I grew up with, and watched you in my undergrad. That's how math professors looked. So I was expecting that type of environment I'm going to be in, and that's how I dressed in grad school. But then they get here and told that, yeah, these professors dress that way, but you need to dress differently. And I was told that by a female faculty member, and I'm sure that's the advice that she got when she was coming up. So, in her mind, I'm sure she thought that she was being helpful. But it's hard that sometimes, it's not only just men who perpetuate these systems. Sometimes it's women too. And, like Dr. Stone mentioned, that sometimes you have to hold yourself accountable. What are you doing to perpetuate that environment? And so when I let a professor call me sweetie and don't say anything to him, the next person that he calls sweetheart has to deal with it too. And so sometimes you have to think about, well, if I let it goes on not just for me, but for other people as well. And that can just be hard to figure out what you're going to do about things like that.
And it's really complicated too when you're more junior in your field. So most of us are assistant professors. And what do you do when it's someone who does have a position of power? Do you take the time to tell them that you don't want them to touch your shoulder or whatever? Or do you, try and use your body language to respond to that, like stepping away or whatever, because these are really tricky things to deal with, keeping in mind that you want a job and you want to advance your career. And so you don't want to do anything to risk that. And at the same time, you need to stand up for yourself as a human with rights, and you shouldn't be treated differently because of one particular feature of your being. And that's a really difficult thing to navigate. So I agree with Dr. Morgan that I don't have a good answer to this either. It's going to depend on each little situation that we deal with.
Yeah, I think that it definitely, the best way is always a way that you can still be comfortable with yourself with, right? You don't have to make a grand gesture. You don't have to be the one to put everything on your shoulders. It is not completely up to you. There are lots of different organizations within, if it's not in your department, it's in your college. If it's not in your college, maybe at your university level, it's somewhere, it's in a professional organization. There are people there who are a unit that support you, and they have policies and ways to go about things, right? So I could give you my opinion on how to deal with things, but my opinion is really strongly based on my personality and what I know I'm capable of taking on myself versus what I'm not capable of taking on. And I think I depend, like and I have been in a situation where it's been, I'm either leaving or things have to change, right? I got to that point and it required some very difficult conversations. But I made sure that I was aware of kind of my, I want to say support system, but I didn't really know the people, but just that there were diversity groups on campus and that there was this push for diversity and increasing diversity. And the Me Too movement was just happening right when I was kind of reaching my threshold of what I could take. And I had a lot of difficult conversations with my department chair and my dean. And when they talked about it in the film as well, right? Like culture, department culture or work culture is huge. It will absolutely drive people out. And I was almost one of those people leaving. But I wanted to stay really badly. And so because I wanted to stay, I made myself have conversations that I would never, ever wish to ever have. And I learned a lot from them. And, you know, sometimes they were good. They made me feel good. Sometimes they made me feel awful. But the best part of all of that mess is that as a department and a college, we have definitely moved forward. And we've had 2 female hires since I started here who have been treated noticeably better than I was when I started. And I got to say, that's a lot of motivation, right? Like it makes it seem like it's worth it. Again, I would never wish to have conversations like that again, but to be able to see that, you know, the next woman hire, it was like, okay, you know, like that's a different response from a colleague than what I would have gotten in that situation. And now this last year, we've just hired another person. And she has more of a voice than either one of us had when we started, right? There's room for her to speak up, and she is the most junior, and it's awesome. Still not the most comfortable, right? Because there's still that like male dominant good old boy culture, and you still are trying to figure it out, but it is slowly turning around. And I think that it will turn around. It may not get in my lifetime to, you know, exactly equal, but it is getting better and people are becoming aware of it. And the education is huge coming to this, not just women coming to this, but men coming to this, right? Like, how do we show this video to men? How do we make them aware of what's beneath the surface on this iceberg? Because they just don't get it. For some reason, there is no motivation, I think, for men to really have to learn this. It's all directed towards women navigating it, right? And I want to change that narrative.
Yeah, because if we want the culture to shift, we can't just rely on talking to other women. We have to have male allies, and men have to be the ones driving this change as well as women. And so it's important for us to get this documentary out, have more people show it, but also to find, you know, good male allies who are going to be supportive of women and maybe recognize what their own behavior needs to change and help to change others' behavior as well.
Mm-hmm.
Thank y'all. Those were great answers. And I'm getting a lot of really good questions. So I'm going to just kind of throw out some of the things, and then each of y'all maybe can address whatever you're comfortable with. So I have questions about what it's like to be a member of the LGBTQ community and be a scientist. How do we support, you know, basically all the intersectional groups? So how do we support more women and women of color in science? How do we support the LGBTQ community in science? And then also There was a question about being in the military and doing science, which maybe Dr. Stone could speak a little about, since her wife was military and is now in science. But I don't know. So anyway, if any of y'all want to tackle any of those or say anything.
All right.
I could, oh, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, being a member of the LGBTQ community, I honestly feel weirder about that than being a woman. I've always had this joke with my friends that I'm a terrible gay person because I don't do things like go to gay organizations. I really don't have many gay friends. And since coming to my current position at Florida Tech, as far as I can tell, I was the first out faculty member there. And so weird things happen. Like my first semester, I became the chair of our diversity committee, which I had no idea really how to do. I got a phone call one time from our development office and they said, where are the gay scholarships? And I said, well, let me Google that for you. Like why, like there were no gay scholarships when I was young. And so that's something else that you have to navigate. And on the flip side though, I feel like I might occupy a weird sort of middle space because I do find myself bonding to my male colleagues and my female colleagues, where I see a lot of my colleagues tend to stay within their own gender group in terms of, you know, who they hang out with outside of work and who they go to for advice. And I'm not sure if that's just me or if it is because of my sexuality that I sort of get this, I don't know, blended experience, if you will. Yeah, so that can be difficult to deal with as well, but all the same things apply as to a woman, right? We are all humans and we all have these features of being human. And if I were to describe myself, woman and gay would be near the end of the list. Those are two things that I happen to be, but I don't consider them my sort of defining features, right? And so we need to get people to look past this sort of surface labels into what, you know, a person or what a whole person is.
Thank you. I would like to speak for a minute about just maybe supporting just in terms of like students of color and having more, you know, women and men of color in BIPOC in science. I think, and I think part of it is just really being intentional about everything we do. And so I know as, you know, a professor, that's something I'm thinking about all the time is like how, you know, who wrote my textbook? What research articles are we, who's really like my AMP textbook is written by a Black man. And like, that was important to me. And so, you know, who is the author of your research articles you're teaching? Who were the subjects? Are women included? Did they take, you know, the ovaries and uterus out of the rats when they did the study so they wouldn't have to deal with the hormones? I mean, this is, you know, what disparities should we look at? And then in the lab, it's, you know, well, I want a multicultural lab. I want students working for me who, you know, I are representing, you know, genders and different communities. I think that's so important. And so I do feel like everything we do has to be so intentional, and it can't be like, oh, I just didn't think about it. Like that's just not, that can't be how it is. Because that's why we're where we are. It just has to be thought about.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I believe that being intentional and being don't just be quiet. And I'm like pretty naturally a quiet person. And so I would never want to like project something on other people. But when I was looking for colleagues at UT, when I first moved here, someone to collaborate with, I was looking in the neuroscience department. I'm just kind of scanning through faculty and kind of reading their like bio page. And I found this man, Mackenzie Howard, who was a new professor there. And what he did was, you know, kind of interesting. But what stood out the most was that he had this inclusion statement as like the very first thing that he said. It wasn't last, It wasn't mixed in there where you couldn't see it. It was, I believe, blah, 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 blah. Everyone is included, blah, 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 and stated particular groups intentionally. And I was like, oh my gosh. Not only are we very good friends now and collaborate together, but I use his statement on my own webpage because I was like, that's awesome, right? Like, I don't want people to think that, oh, I'm including it because the provost has told me that I have to include this on my syllabus. You know, it is one of the first things that I'm showing. So being intentional is huge. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, like I was part of the problem. I have so many bias in my mind when I talk to my students, when I talk to other people, right? Because I was just raised a very different way. And I feel like if I can change the way that I'm thinking, right? It's not that I will ever, or at least not now, I still don't just naturally say, I see everyone, you know, without any difference at all, right? Like I see things and I still have these natural bias that pop into my mind, but I allow myself to acknowledge them and very purposefully twist it around and get that out, right? Because if you don't actually let yourself see it, you will be that person who's like, oh, I didn't know, that wasn't a big deal, I don't get it. You know, like you have to let yourself acknowledge it. And it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means that you're a person, you're human. And this is life. We all have bias. And so if I can change that behavior, so can my male colleagues, right? I also think that I have a lifetime of analyzing how I behave in front of men, and men do not necessarily have those same expectations. So I do think it's a little bit harder for them to change their thinking because they've never really been asked to, at least some of them. So it is going to take a little while, but being intentional is definitely key in starting that.
Thank you. So how, just a general question, how do y'all stay motivated? And how do you encourage yourself knowing this is, you know, science is male dominated, or society in general is male dominated. America is male dominated. How do we stay motivated?
Well, you know, for me, I think this is probably true for everyone on the panel. I got into this field because I love what I do. Even from a young age, I always liked math, and I always knew I wanted to do something with math. And so, you know, for me, staying motivated, if I have a day where I feel discouraged by something that happened, I bring it back to the science that I went into this field for a reason. I feel like I can make a difference in the world with this field, and I'm not going to let some jerk take that away from me. And, you know, one of the things I liked about the movie was that they started off with each woman talking about her area of research before they even discussed the things that she had gone through. They all got a chance to say, oh, I work with zebrafish, or I work on cliff retreat. And they got to really shine and show what they loved before we talked about the obstacles in their way. And so that's how I keep myself motivated, is remembering why I went in this field in the first place. And the love of the material can keep you going through all the hardship.
Thank you. Yeah, great answer. Dr. Stone, Dr. Proctor, what motivates y'all?
Yeah, Dr. Morgan nailed it. Of course, I'm very passionate about my research. If I don't get to work with monkeys for a few weeks, I get very grumpy. But you know, that's sort of the science side. So maybe on the mentorship side, part of what motivates me is that we know that if the next generation sees people like us in these positions where we are faculty members, we are doing real high quality science, that's going to be how we get this culture to shift, right? Is by getting the next generation to change these things. For the older generation, we know from psychological studies, it's harder for you to incorporate new worldviews as you age. And so my hope is really the next generation. And so part of what motivates me is being that person who can be a model for the student sitting in my classroom to say that, oh yeah, you can be a woman or gay and still be a scientist in these types of positions. Because I think that that's ultimately what's going to help a lot, is by showing people what a scientist looks like.
Yeah, and I'd like to jump on what you just said about particularly being gay and being a woman in science. I would absolutely agree with Dr. Proctor that I was probably finding it harder to fit in being gay than being a woman. Partly because I was openly a woman for most of my life, right? And then it was like the whole coming out, already being a part of the research community, and it was like, hey, guess what? Everyone that I've known up to this point. But at first I wanted to kind of keep that very quiet. And then with some, lots of talks with my wife, it was like, why aren't you proud of that? What if there was a student in your classroom who never saw a gay person as a scientist, who never saw that they never saw themselves in that position because they were just so ashamed, or they just didn't think they would be accepted? And it was like, oh, and I'd never thought about that. And that's really what gave me motivation to just be able to speak freely about being gay and screw them, right? Like, screw the other people that it makes it uncomfortable, because if there's one other person that it helps them, then that's awesome. That's exactly what I want to be doing. And that's changing, the face of a scientist. And I openly talk about my wife and our daughter and our family, and it's definitely not something that I'm ashamed of. I remember taking my wife to a conference a few years ago, and we went to like the big publishing banquet dinner or whatever, and it was a table of all men, and they had saved a seat, and you could take a person with you. And so I was like, okay, I'm taking my wife, and like nobody even knows that I have a wife, but I'm going to take her and introduce her to everyone. And so it was my wife and me at this table of, with like 12 other people. Anna, you would know everyone that was sitting at that table. And my wife was 7 months pregnant, very, very pregnant. She was only 7 months pregnant, but she was very pregnant. And also my wife definitely has, I don't even know how I'm supposed to talk about it correctly. She's not feminine. So she shows up to dinner in a beautiful suit with a giant pregnant belly sticking out. And if you want to see a bunch of men's heads like wanting to explode, that will do it. But her necktie was beautiful, and it went all the way over her nice round belly with her shirt, extra large shirt tucked into her pants, and we had a very lovely dinner. And by the end of that dinner, everything was fine. But I got to say, I was definitely nervous to begin with. But people will be fine. I want to, Peter Raven, like a super older guy in our field, when I was telling him one day, he was like, or I was saying, I have a wife, like I'm married, but I have a wife, not a husband. And he was like, oh, that's fine. He goes, it's not like it's church. And he was like, you're part of, this is a science group. Not many people, care about the religious aspect of it or blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I don't even know what you're saying, but as long as you don't have a bias towards me, I'm pretty happy.
He's also retired now.
Yeah.
That was one of the questions, really was like, oh, I lost it. But I do feel that way about some of the older people in the field who everyone respects. Is like, we are just kind of waiting for them to retire, because I don't know if you can change everyone.
But to be fair, there are also some young people in the field who also need to change, and they don't have the excuse of being from a different generation. So I don't want to bag on the older people too much, because it's definitely a cross-generation issue.
Yeah. And there are lots of lovely, open-minded men who are absolutely advocates for women. I mean, I have met more of them since I've started at UT than I've met people who aren't advocates for women. And so there is that. Unfortunately, it's like the squeaky wheel gets the attention, right? But there are wonderful, wonderful men out there that are absolutely supportive of women and absolutely speak up and are advocates for us. And find them, because they're wonderful to have as friends and colleagues.
All right, so we have 5 minutes left, and I want to get to this question because, you know, I think it's so important with just like, we know the pandemic is affecting women more than men, especially women in science. You can look at publications and how the number of publications from women have gone down. So any tips on balancing time for research while also devoting yourself to mentoring and just generally taking time to smash the patriarchy?
Yeah, this is one of those questions again where I'm like, I don't know if I have an answer to this. Just kind of disappointing. Like, it has been very hard to balance everything with the pandemic. You know, I have a 1.5-year-old at home, and so when I was working from home when COVID first started, it was hard. He had just been born, so it was hard to, like, normally in a normal year I would have childcare, and that would help me balance work and life, having like a clear delineation between home life and work life. But when you're working at home, everything's just kind of mixed together. It's hard to keep things separate. And, you know, when it comes to working on a paper or feeding a baby, you're not gonna, you know which one has to go first, because you can't say, well, you can eat later, I can just finish this simulation that I'm running. So work winds up taking a back seat more than you would expect. And I mean, I would love to hear what other people say, because I need help balancing research with everything else. So yeah, I don't have an answer to that. It's a hard question.
I think one thing that's so important that we often sort of let slide when we're trying to balance all of this is time for ourselves. For me personally, I've realized that if I make time for myself, I can figure out the balance of everything else a lot better. I recently went to a women's seminar series, and it lasted 9 months. We had a speaker once a month, and every single one of those strong, powerful women said, you have got to learn how to meditate. So I've been trying to learn how to meditate. If you're terrible at it, like I am, there's this amazing product called a Muse headband. It actually senses your brain waves and gives you audio feedback when you get your brain in the right state, which is very cool and sciencey. And so, you know, that's one of the ways that I'm trying to help make room for myself so that I can then make room for everything else.
That's a great answer. Yeah, I think self-care, so trendy term, but yeah, taking time for yourself is so important. And if you're stressed out, you can't deal with any other stresses. So, Dr. Stone, any final thoughts?
I mean, I'm just proud of myself for making it this far. It's crazy. It's a crazy time. And I'm lucky that I have a lot of people in my life that remind me that it's a crazy time. No one was ever prepared for dealing with this. So if I'm mindful of that about myself and my wife and my family, I'm also mindful about that with my colleagues and my students. And so it's like, talk about changing priorities, right? Like, my priorities for my students was one thing a year and a half ago, and is something different now, right? Like, what is it that they could actually get out of this time? What are they capable of retaining or finding as like a skill that they can take with them? Because it's not going to be pushing them and pushing them and pushing them when they can't manage it, right? Like, it's just a lot of shifting of priorities, a lot of shifting of my own priorities. It's been crazy having a little kid at home. She was 6 months old when the pandemic started, and now she'll be almost 2, or she is almost 2. And she's been here. She hasn't been at daycare. We've been upstairs in this room. My wife is, you know, her desk is like right next to mine, and we have headphones and we have meetings going on at the same time. You know, like, it's so different. And my students, I interact with them on Zoom. Sometimes I see them in person in the lab, but it's a lot of like if any student has an issue at all with something, it's like, okay, let's work with this. You know, it's all about finding a different way to navigate through it because it's different priorities. So that part is totally not my personality. I am like black and white. We do it this way, and that's how we get through things. So this year has totally changed my mind with that. I'm not this easygoing usually. I just like to say that.
So thank y'all so much. On that note, you know, I do think we all need to be gentle with ourselves and just be grateful that we sort of survived this. I mean, literally, and that I want to also just tell all our students who are presenting their work tomorrow at the research conference that you should be so proud of yourself, and we are excited you're able to showcase your work. And thank you to the panelists for sharing their insight. I really appreciate y'all's time.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.